The Epistle to the Philippians, sometimes called the Letter of Joy for its uplifting and hopeful attitude, was written by Paul to the saints in the city of Philippi in Macedonia. Macedonia being in northern Greece today, it was the first city on the continent of Europe to receive the gospel. This epistle, in my research, turned out to be very fascinating. The scholarly theories are just fun with this one. See, now, nobody doubts that Paul wrote the epistle to the Philippians. That is not in question. It is also generally assumed that he wrote it from Rome. It is one of the prison epistles, along with Colossians, Philemon, and Ephesians. And so it is believed that he wrote it during his first imprisonment in Rome. Now, there are some disputes on that point, which we will talk about in a little bit. But the fun part is, while some still believe it to be a single letter, there are many who believe it to be an amalgamation or a composite of multiple letters that were later stitched together by compilers who collected up Paul's writings. In this theory, generally speaking, there are three letters that are identified. The first one, chapter 1, chapter 2, as well as the first verse of chapter 3. The second letter is the rest of chapter 3. The third letter is chapter 4, verses 10 through 20. The rest of chapter 4 is generally broken apart and assigned to one of the other three letters, but could be from a fourth letter, maybe a fourth and a fifth letter. The theory is just that he wrote several shorter letters, and that later the compiler got all the letters that he wrote to the Philippians and put them together in a single document, possibly arranging them in a way for a specific message to be told. It is also possible that what he had were not complete letters. Maybe they had stored all the letters in the basement and water and insects, mice got to them, damaged portions of them. And so to preserve what was left, he took the pieces, the fragments of letters, and just made a copy of it in a single document. This is something that I don't know if it is true or not. It is true that Paul wrote this epistle. Prophets agree with that, so I have no reason to doubt it. But could it be a composite of multiple letters? We know that a number of the revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants are composites of multiple revelations, sometimes given a couple of years apart. And Joseph Smith would write a revelation down, but then when it went to be printed 3 or 4 years later, he would add to it. He would expound on it a little bit. Now, it is also possible that this is all just a single letter, but that Paul wrote the first part and then got interrupted and came back after a day or so and finished it, or wrote the next part. And so that rather than being multiple letters, it is just a single letter written over a longer period of time. These are all fun theories. Makes the whole thing very interesting. And some of the things that back up these theories are, it does seem to have a somewhat abrupt shifts in the writing, in the message. It's a little haphazard in the way it's organized. And there's somewhat contradictory information regarding Paul's companion Epaphroditus. So all these things kind of hint at the idea that these are not one letter, or at least were not written all at the same time. Now, if they are separate letters, they could have been written at separate times and in different places. There are theories that place the letter as early as being written from Ephesus, where it says in his letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, he mentions afflictions that they went through in Ephesus, and people take that to mean that they were thrown in prison. And so it could be that one of these letters, anyways, was written from Ephesus. One could be written from Caesarea, when he was in prison there, from the years 58 to 60. Could have been written in Rome, either the first or second time he was in prison. So if it is multiple letters, it could have been written over a space of about 10 years. Or it could be one letter written over the space of a month, but with interruptions. It's all very interesting, and it is all, even the Joseph Smith translation, again, can't fill us in on this, because even if it was multiple letters, the Joseph Smith translation just gives us a more correct translation. It doesn't tell us when it was written. It just gives us a translation of it. Now, a brief history of the church in Philippi. As I said, it was the first church in Europe. first city in Europe to receive the gospel. This was on Paul's second missionary journey. On this journey, he travels up through Galatia and up into Macedonia, first going to Philippi. Now, he goes to a coastal town, coastal village that's just to the south of Philippi, but the first place he preaches is in the city of Philippi. He has much success converting a woman named Lydia and her family. He also exorcises a slave girl, which causes a big tumult in the city. He is arrested, but an earthquake releases him or breaks open the prison, and the jailer is converted, but the magistrate asks him to leave, and so he goes to Thessalonica. Now, on this missionary journey, he goes down into Athens and Corinth, and then back to Antioch. On his third missionary journey, he goes out to Ephesus, where he stays for 2.5 to 3 years, during which time he does take a brief trip into Corinth, although it is unlikely that he travels through Philippi at that time. When those 3 years are over, he does go back into Greece, most likely this time going up through Philippi, because it talks about him going into Macedonia. And so he probably goes through Philippi, down into Corinth, and then he goes back up to Philippi to escape the Jews on his way back to Jerusalem. This visit between Philippi and Corinth is about 3 months, maybe a little more. Once he leaves and goes back to Jerusalem, at least during the time of the book of the Acts, he never returns to Philippi. But that is the beginning of the church in Philippi. It was the start of the Christian faith in Europe. Now, if this was written as 3 different letters, then we can't really specify exactly why he wrote each one individually. One seems to be a kind of thank you note for some gifts that were sent to him, but the rest of it, there's no particular reasons, no event for its writing. I think it is Paul writing, just like he did with the Ephesians, as a kind of preparation for what's ahead. He's writing this shortly before the great Christian persecution begins after the fire in Rome, and he is preparing the people. But this time it is not just preaching unity, which it is, but it's also preaching a hope in Christ, a hope for the resurrection. Live as saints and hope for the resurrection. And he does talk about the old divisions of Jew versus Gentile, but for the most part it is a letter of joy. As I said, it is exulting in Christ and salvation. It even includes a hymn of salvation in the 2nd chapter. This is Paul rejoicing in the gospel and sharing his rejoicings with the saints in Philippi. So now, let us read Paul's rejoicings in his epistle to the Philippians.